Our reading this morning is quite a short one. It's from the book of Ezra, and I'll try and get the names right. It's chapter 3 and verse 8 it starts from, through to the end of the chapter. And this, I'll touch on a little bit of background in a minute, but this is after some of the Israelites have come back from captivity in Babylon. And it says this: in the 2nd month of the 2nd year after their arrival at the house of God in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and the rest of their brothers, the priests and the Levites, and all who had returned from the captivity to Jerusalem, began the work, appointing Levites 20 years of age and older to supervise the building of the house of the Lord. Jeshua and his sons and brothers, and Kadmiel and his sons, descendants of Hodaviah, and the sons of Henadad and their sons and brothers, all Levites, joined together in supervising those working on the house of God. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments and with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, took their places to praise the Lord, as prescribed by David, king of Israel. With praise and thanksgiving they sang to the Lord, "He is good. His love to Israel endures forever." And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping, because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away. Let's just pray. Father, thank you for your word. Sometimes, Father, we find it difficult, challenging. Sometimes we find it comforting. Sometimes we just don't understand it at all. But Father, would you bless this particular portion of your word to us this morning? Would you take what I'm going to say, use the bits that are really from you and delete the bits that aren't, so that the result will be we draw closer to you through Jesus. Amen. Well, number 2 in this mini-series of 3 sermons on rebuilding the temple. Now, last time I got the middle one of a mini-series of 3, I had a little moan, a little pity party, saying, I got the bit in the middle. And I was taken to task for that afterwards. I said, because somebody said to me, you know, anybody can do an introduction and a conclusion, but the middle bit's the meat, it's the important bit. So I thought, oh, okay. That's not putting you down in terms, because they're all different subjects. But then, at the beginning, I asked what your immediate reaction was to what is a temple. I wondered whether, if Debbie had been here, or as Julie is here, or possibly Sharon in her capacity as a retired nurse, somebody would say, well, it's a bit on the side of your head, isn't it? But nobody offered that one, so that's good. It's quite simply in the dictionary a place of worship, symbolising a house or a dwelling place of God. We've got, in our case, God with a big G. In the dictionary, it's any God with little g's. Well, the first question I had to ask, well, does God need one? Does God need a temple, a dwelling place? And I guess the simple answer is, well, of course not. He's got the whole world, he's got the whole creation to be his dwelling place. And however splendid the temple, the church, the chapel, the cathedral might be, and there are some pretty splendid buildings around the world, aren't there? Some pretty amazing, especially when you think of the period when so many of them were built with the technology they didn't have. It's just mind-blowing. And some of those people say, oh, well, yeah, but they're just buildings. But no, most of them were built with pure motives. They were built for the glory of God. Some of them were built out of guilt, but many of them were built with good motives to glorify God. So no, God doesn't need these places built by man, but he allows them to be built. And I believe he allows them to be built because he knows our limitations only too well. He knows the limits of our understanding, and he knows our need to focus on things that are visible and physical. Just think about communion. It's a spiritual act. It is a physical, it's a visible symbol for our memorial of Jesus and our new contract with him. We need things like birthdays and Christmas and anniversaries as physical remembrances of things. Now, although this series was triggered by our building programme here, Nick triggered it back a few months ago. Didn't you know you were guilty on that one? And that's important. It's good. The building work here is very important. But it's very important, again, to note a huge difference, which I'll refer to again a couple of times later, in this. The difference between rebuilding and repairing. The temple in this story, and we'll go back to it in a minute, had been completely destroyed. It had been torn completely down, nothing left, apart from the foundation of the altar, I think I'm right in saying. It needed rebuilding. Compare it to Coventry Cathedral after the Blitz. If any of you have ever been to Coventry, there are a few walls of the old one standing, but I think it was not until about the early 60s when they decided, right, we're going to build a new cathedral, and they did a complete new building in a modern way. Compared to a neglect of maintenance or poor design, and a bit of that we're guilty of here over the years of neglect of maintenance. Perhaps locally, not in church terms, perhaps locally our best example of that would be Castle Drogo. If any of you have been out there in the last couple of years, Drogo is undergoing a massive repair programme, costing millions, because largely of poor design in the first place, and then a lack of understanding of how the maintenance should have been carried on. I guess that the reordering and refurbishment of the inside of this church under Darren, the previous pastor, actually came closer to a rebuilding than what we're embarking on now. But anyway, this Ezra account is of a rebuild. And it's significant, as all things are obviously in the word, it's significant for this reason. The total destruction of the temple had been carried out by the Babylonians, who God had allowed to overwhelm Israel. He'd allowed it because Israel had gone away from him. As Reg was praying just now, the country, our nation amongst others, is getting a long way from God. And we do wonder what's going to happen, what God is going to allow to happen to this country and to other nations in the world to draw us back to him. So Israel required a completely fresh start, and it's hugely symbolic in spiritual terms. Again, a bit more of that later again. Now, you might have noticed that our reading didn't actually get as far as the rebuild of the temple. Not the complete rebuild, it was only the laying of the foundation. So I think we need a very brief history, Tracy, and apologies to those of you who are better at teaching than me, like Rob. But this is how I summarised it. As I've already mentioned, Israel was disobedient, so they were overwhelmed by the Babylonians, taken off into exile in Babylon, everything they knew and loved destroyed or pillaged by them. In turn, Babylon was overthrown by the Persians under one King Cyrus. Now, he was a good guy, it seems. He sussed that God was in charge, and he allowed for the repatriation and allowed for the temple restoration to begin. And that's where we came in today. But as these things do, it all took time. When the Israelites got back to their home country and started settling in their towns, their new neighbours, i.e. the ones who'd been there all the time, the Samaritans and so on, weren't very happy. They didn't like the prospect of Israel coming back as a nation, becoming a powerful state. That sound familiar to recent history with Israel? Yeah. And so the first thing they did was they offered them an alliance. The Samaritans came in and said, we'll come and help you rebuild your temple. They were rebuffed. The elders of Israel smelt a rat in there, and the reason was, it was a bit like something I was reminded of. Does anybody ever watch the Murdoch mysteries on television? Yeah, Sharon's a Murdoch mystery person. Well, they're lovely because they're set late 1800s, aren't they? I think, perhaps early 1900s. And every now and then they put these sort of prophetic bits in where people are developing microwaves and that sort of thing. Quite amazing. And the one we watched the other night included the development of the electric car. And they had a competition between the guy who developed this little electric car and Henry Ford, who'd got his big internal combustion engine. The reason I'm telling you this is because Ford wanted to buy out all the rights to the electric car. Did they want to develop it? No, they wanted to squash it. And that can quite often happen in business today. A business will buy out a good idea so they can bury it and get on with what they're doing. They don't like the competition. This was what the Samaritans had in mind in offering to go into alliance with the Israelites. They didn't really want to help and share in it. They wanted to make sure they'd got control over them. Once they'd been rebuffed, they appealed to the new Persian king, because, as I said, time had gone on. We're now on King Darius, and they exposed to him a danger to his control. They said, these Israelites, they're rebuilding their city, they're rebuilding, you've said they're doing their temple, they're doing their city, everything else. They're not going to pay their taxes to you, they're going to take over this part of your empire. What about it? Result, King's planning permission was revoked. Everything had to go on hold for at least the next chapter in the account, which is plus or minus 15 years or so. And then God spoke through a couple of prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, and work started again on the temple without permission. Consequently, a whole lot more correspondence. Darius looked up in his royal records, found that actually Cyrus had given them permission, and did some investigation, and actually the Israelites weren't trying to take over in that corner. Did a U-turn, instruct the enemies not only to allow the work to resume, but to help and fund it on pain of death. Another 4 years or so, and the temple was finally completed by the middle of chapter 6. So where were we? Yeah, foundations. In fact, prior to the foundations, the first half of this chapter 3 in Ezra tells us that soon after the Israelites returned from exile, once they'd settled into their towns, they all came together into Jerusalem, and despite their fear of the surrounding people, as recorded in verse 3, They built an altar to God. One of the first things they did on return, built an altar to God, and in this case, the foundation was still there. They built the altar on the foundation of the old altar. And they offered there burnt offerings and free will offerings. An interesting note there was no mention of sin offerings at that stage. Burnt offerings are symbolic of a complete surrender to God, just as we were singing a few minutes ago. We give all to God. Do hope you didn't perjure yourselves as you were singing that. As we sing these songs and we're promising so much to God, He'll listen to us, He'll take us at our word. Free will offerings, they symbolise fellowship with God and thanksgiving to God. Back again to sort of going backwards in this in this book. Chapter 1 and verse 5 says this: that once they've been given permission to leave Persia and go back to Jerusalem, the family heads of Judah and Benjamin and the priests and Levites, everyone whose heart God had moved, prepared to go up and build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. Everyone whose heart God had prepared. Are we all willing to do that? To let God speak into our hearts, prepare us to do what He wants us to do. So, burnt offerings, surrender to God. Free will offerings, fellowship and thanksgiving. Just as teaching you'll hear on giving tithes and offerings. Tithes are your sort of duty of worship, of giving to God. Offerings are the bits that come on top, just as we have with our gift day appeal for the work that needs to be done here. Then the foundations were laid. Foundations have to be right. Andrew already alluded to this last week with the references in the New Testament of Christ being the chief cornerstone of our faith. What a lovely picture. I'm not a builder by any stretch of the imagination, but in the course of maintenance and farm work and stuff, you end up building things a little bit. And I know that for me, I have to get the first bit right. If I don't get the first bit right, everything else goes totally pear-shaped. And it's the same with foundations. The foundations have to be right, because everything else grows from there. And they have to be strong. We already mentioned that earlier when we were talking about what the temple was going to need, strong foundations. Reminded of Matthew 16, with Jesus talking to Peter. And there's that lovely wordplay in the Greek on this. Jesus says, remember roughly, the text says, Jesus says to Peter, you're Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. Now, the wordplay is he uses two words for Peter there. The first word is Petros. You're Peter, Petros, which means a little rock or a pebble. And then the second word is Petra, which means a huge, great rock, something really solid. And I think my understanding of that translation is, you are Peter, with Jesus, the little stone. But on this rock, me, Jesus, I will build my church. You're Petros, the little stone which is needed in the building. But on this huge foundation, I'll build my church. And we read then, foundations laid, and there's a great shout of praise and joy, except the older men who remember the splendour of the original temple. And they weep. Now, I haven't found it anywhere in here. It seems to be that most of the commentators say the old men are weeping because they don't see the new temple being a patch on the old one. I don't see that in the text, to be honest. It could be that that was the case. But could there be other reasons they were weeping? Could they simply have been weeping for joy because something was happening, a rebuild was happening? Could they be weeping for the remembrance of the past sin of the nation which had caused all the problem in the first place? Matthew Henry in his commentary says, well, if that was the case, that was a very good thing. It's good for us to really be taken up in remembrance of where we've gone wrong in the past. Years ago, I remember sort of part of my testimony, which I'm not going to go into now because God put a stop on that bit, was how some of my previous life had been. On one day, when I was thinking about it, God put his finger right on me. He said, David, do you actually realise how much I hated the way you were living? Wow. God hates our sin. So we can weep for the past. Should it detract from the celebration they were having because the foundations were laid? Maybe not. But it was still real. One last point on the sort of physical versus the symbolic nature of a temple, of whatever sort, whether it's a cathedral, whether it's a chapel or whatever. But perhaps particularly it pertains to a building like ours. And that is its practicality. Its practicality as a central meeting place for a fellowship. House groups are vital, home groups, but somewhere that people know this is where they can come to meet the fellowship, within the fellowship, to worship God. Centrality and its versatility. For what? Serving the community. It's not just here to serve us, it's to serve everybody out there. And that's important for our place within the community, our place in God's purpose for us. What were our purposes, as Jeff was doing the other day? To love one another, to encourage one another, to build one another up, to obey Jesus' teachings, to make disciples of people through witnessing and sharing. And our building can help in that task. The other option to not repairing the building, for those of us who don't know what we're going through at the moment, well, get rid of it. Sell it. We'll go and hire the school hall. I've been there in a couple of situations. It's got some advantages, no worries about the building maintenance, but it's got a lot of disadvantages too, because people don't see it as being a church. And even that can have its plus sides, because people can be less hesitant about coming into a building which they don't see as church. But I think, on balance, to have a central place, it is important. One final thought. I said at the beginning that I'd returned to this rebuild and repair theme. What about us? The whole spiritual symbolism of this. It's often said that as we're called and come to God, he accepts us just as we are. Is that right? But he loves us too much to let us stay that way. He loves us far too much to let us stay that way. Our lives, our former lives, are destroyed. They're eaten up by sin. And what needs to be done? They need to be patched up and repaired? No. They've been destroyed. They need to be rebuilt. We need a fresh start in Jesus. If anybody's got problems or issues with that, plenty of people here will talk to you this morning. But we need to be aware, many of us have made that complete start. We've been rebuilt. And then the repair bits kick in, because we need to keep coming back and back to God, saying, where are we going now? Amen.